land, on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down. There are evergreen trees that been blowing in the breeze, and their fruitage is brighter than gold. There the throne of God stands in the fairest of lands, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down. There's a home in that land, at the Father's right hand. There are mansions whose joys are untold, and perennial spring, where the saints ever sing, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is paved with pure gold, and the sun it shall never go down. I have heard of a land on a faraway strand. In the Bible the story is told, where cares never come, never darkness nor gloom, and nothing shall ever grow old. In that beautiful land, on the faraway strand, no storms with their blast ever frown. The street, I am told, is there are evergreen trees that blow in the breeze, and their fruitage is brighter than gold.
Or at least as it's presented in Mark, is kind of the climax of his teaching. He started off in Galilee. He is now expanding out. And so chapter 5 and verse 21, when Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, that is the other side of the Sea of Galilee. He's basically bouncing back and forth across the Sea of Galilee. When he had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him as he was beside the sea. Why is a great crowd gathered around him? What brings out great crowds? Something novel, okay. That's part of what brings out great crowds. Word of mouth usually brings out great crowds. If you get a reputation for being a good entertainer and you go into town, you get a bigger crowd than someone who's got no reputation. If you get a reputation of being particularly intelligent and capable of teaching, then your crowds are larger than if no one has ever heard of you. We generate buzz usually in a community if we want to build a crowd. We give some pre-information and put some promotion out there that says, hey, this person has been to this place and has done this thing and has had this education or written this book and is a New York Times bestseller. And that drums up interest, because in the days between when that starts and the person arrives, people talk. Well, that's exactly what's taking place here. People are hearing Jesus. They're seeing the miracles. They're hearing about the miracles. They're coming out to where he is to see what he will do and to hear what he will say. And that's what's taking place here. There's this great crowd that's gathered about him. Then came out one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, my little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her that she may be made well and live. And so here is one of the rulers of the synagogue. I'm not sure which synagogue. Exactly which city he's from. It may tell us in a minute. I can't recall if the city's named. I don't think so, though. But anyway, he has heard of Jesus. He has heard of Jesus' miraculous power. His daughter is sick to the point of death, and so he goes and throws himself at Jesus and says, hey, come help my poor little girl. He went with him, and a great crowd followed him, thronged about him. And there was a woman who had a discharge of blood for 12 years, who had suffered much under many physicians. See, medicine back then wasn't any better than medicine is today. When you get treated for something, sometimes the treatment's as bad as the disease. She had suffered under many physicians. That means under the care of physicians, trying to help her, trying to stop her problem unsuccessfully. And this has been an ongoing problem now for 12 years. She has been losing blood. Listen, there's all kind of complications that arise from that. She was sick. She had suffered much under many physicians, had spent all that she had. Her entire wealth had been spent on this problem without success. Was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard the reports about Jesus. You hear that? Word of mouth. Now, you'll recall we ended last Sunday morning with the one who had been healed, had the legion of demons cast out of him, saying, let me go with you. And Jesus saying what? No, I need you to stay here and tell people in this place. She had heard. She had heard the people talking about Jesus and what Jesus had done. She had heard the reports about Jesus. She came up behind him in the crowd and touched his garment. For she said, if I touch even his garments, I'll be made well. And immediately the flow of blood dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. And Jesus, perceiving in himself that power had gone out from him, immediately turned about the crowd and said, who touched my garments? Now, The irony in all this is we've been told that there is a large crowd and that they thronged about him. What does that word thronged mean? Yeah, they just surrounded him. They were all around him. And so somebody touches the hem of his robe and he says, hey, somebody touched me. Who was it? His disciples said, you see the crowd pressing in around you, and yet you say, who touched me? Well, of course you were touched by someone. Look at all these people crowding in around you. He looked around to see who had done it, but the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, be healed of your disease. So that's just another miraculous power demonstrated before man. All of this for the purpose of what? God was bearing witness with him. God was bearing witness through these acts so that people may know that, listen, there's something special about what he's saying, because everything that Jesus was about what? What he was teaching. Yes.
There was something different about those who were just crowding around him and touching him because of the close proximity. And her.
Yes.
She had faith that if she touched him, she would be healed.
Yeah, and I also say this, there's something different about someone who just goes to a church building to listen to preaching because they're curious, and someone who goes to worship in faith. God knows the difference between the two. God knows what we're doing, and he knows why we're doing it. He knows whether or not we're doing lip service to please men, or we're humbling our heart before him. And that's part of what's taught in this. And he was aware of this woman. He was aware of her faith. He was aware of her need. He was aware of her healing. Right. And he wanted everyone to know. And that was a great observation. His power didn't go to just everyone who came up to him. His power went out to those who came up to him in faith. Listen, that's still the case. What is the power of God? Salvation. Is everyone going to be saved simply because Jesus went to the cross? No, only those who come to him through faith. So all of these are teaching us. And the fact that he made an interchange about this tells us that he was trying to instruct those people who were around them about what happened and about the meaning of it. The fact that he said, your faith has made you well, means that he wanted that crowd to know that faith was essential. The fact that he said, go in peace and be healed of your disease. Look, she had already been healed, right? The blood flow had already stopped. So why did he say, go in peace and be healed? So that everyone would know what had taken place because of her faith. What can we receive from Christ if we go to him in faith? What will we receive from Christ if we just go because we're curious? And listen, it don't stop there. And keep in mind, this story is a sub-story within this larger story where the ruler of the synagogue has come and said, my daughter is dying. And Jesus is pausing and interacting as he's traveling. While he was still speaking, there came from the ruler's house some who said, your daughter is dead. Why trouble the teacher any further? So in the delay between the crowd and him interacting with this woman who he healed, the little girl dies. And the servants come from the house and say, this is a lost cause. Don't worry about it. Don't bother this guy anymore. She's dead. Overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the ruler of the synagogue, do not fear, only believe. And he allowed no one to follow him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. And they came to the house of the ruler of the synagogue, and Jesus saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. Apparently, the Bible is true when it says there's nothing new under the sun. When young people die, there's big crowds and a lot of tears. Still to this day, biggest funerals I've ever been to were funerals of young people. When he had entered, he said, "Why are you making a commotion and weeping? The child is not dead, but sleeping." Was the child sleeping? So what's he doing here? He's getting ready to show his power, and he's getting ready to teach regarding death. In fact, throughout the Bible, death is described as sleep. Because death is not the terminating end. But that's the way we perceive it. And so he's teaching us about death here. And he's teaching us about who has the power of life and death. They laughed at him. He put them all outside. He took the child's father and mother and those who were with him, and they went into the child, where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up and began walking, for she was 12 years of age. And they were immediately overcome with amazement. And he strictly charged them that no one should know this, and told them to give her something to eat. Now, there's two things that we need to keep in mind here. He actually cleared the room intentionally. And he did this thing with just a few witnesses. He even pared down which of his disciples he allowed to come with him. And it was apparently him and the three of them and the mother and the father and the dead little girl, and that was all that was in the room when he worked this miracle. And then he told the people, the witnesses, don't talk about this. And there is, I think, a potential lesson here. I wouldn't be dogmatic about this because it doesn't expressly say this is why he did this. He had already essentially told the crowds what he was going to do. He had already said to them, the child is not dead, she's sleeping. They laughed at him. He didn't want them going around. He wanted the people to believe because of what they heard. He wanted them to have faith. Because your faith has made you well. See, so the focus of the last part of this is the role of faith between us and the source. Now, keep in mind, this all starts with a series of parables about the seed, which produces growth within us. And the people, those of us that are sowing this seed, don't even know how the growth happens. But it says the power is in what? It's in the soil. The power is in the seed. The power is in everything but us. It's not within man who walks to direct his steps. But Jesus was more than a mere man. He was Emmanuel, God with us. He had the power of God. He was the power of creation. He had the power over the nature. He had the power over the spirit world. He had the power over life and death. And these people, it says, are amazed. We keep seeing words like that, astonished and amazed, both at his teaching and at his works. Where should that lead? Okay, so just imagine this. Imagine that there is somebody crisscrossing the earth. We'll say the United States. Let's make it more narrow. Crisscrossing the United States. And they plan to make a stop in Lafayette. And the scuttlebutt about this individual is that there's something special about them. They're teaching some things and teaching in ways that are just different than other people who have taught us. They're not teaching from authority, they're teaching as the authority. And they've demonstrated these powers. And there are these eyewitnesses testifying. He calmed a storm. He cast out demons. He raised the dead. And they come into Lafayette and they speak to you. How do you receive that person? You're amazed by what you've heard and now you experience it firsthand. How do you receive them? I'm sorry? Okay. You would think that, I mean, that's what drives people to go and see to begin with. What else? Any other?
Strengthening the faith, that's listening and receiving to strengthen faith.
So let's look at the beginning of chapter 6, because something interesting happens here. He went away from there and came to his hometown. What's his hometown? Nazareth. Can anything good come from Nazareth?
Yeah.
His disciples followed him. On the Sabbath, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were astonished. Again, notice the astonishment at his teaching. Where did this man get these things? What is the wisdom given to him? And so they're noticing that the things that he's teaching, these are not common things. Where did it come from? Where did he get this information? Where did he get this wisdom? How are such mighty works done by his hands? They'd heard of the miracles. Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary and brother of James and Joseph and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? And they all took offense at him. Quite contrary to receiving him with open arms, they reject him. They're astonished, amazed at his teaching. They've heard about the miracles. They still refuse to believe. Why?
Sin, unbelief, hard-headed.
Yeah, well, hard-headedness is getting something. The bulletin article, if you hadn't seen the bulletin yet today, actually deals with this topic to some extent, not with this event, but with this topic. Paul talks about his persecution of the church in terms of him doing it ignorantly in unbelief. And then...
Both of those do not claim you to be innocent. I mean,
Right. Oh,
actually, there are reasons to die.
exactly.
Ignorance kills.
And he wrote to the church at Corinth about unbelievers who don't see because there's a veil. And I would submit to you that the unbelief, the attitude, the prejudicial belief that we carry into this is what prevents us from accepting what is obviously there. Paul rejected Christ because it wasn't Paul's conception of what the Christ was going to be. It's the same reason people do it today. Or because the Christ demands of us something that we don't want to give. The rich young ruler. What do I still lack? Well, keep the commandments. Well, I've done that. Well, have you really done that? Let's test. Take all your wealth, give it to the poor, and go and live. He went away sad because he owned much. See, Jesus was the same Jesus The same teacher that he came to looking for eternal life. He didn't like the consequences of the teaching, though. He didn't like the change that it demanded. That's a prejudicial bias that we bring in and say, you know what, that's a bridge too far. I ain't going there. I ain't changing that way. Absolutely not. You're a kook. And what these people had a problem with is they knew him. They knew his mother and his father and his brothers and his sisters. They knew he was a carpenter. They watched him grow up. And they were amazed and saying things like, where did he get all of this information? Where did he get this great wisdom? But instead of saying, let me learn from him, they rejected him. They were blinded by their prejudices. Jesus said to them, a prophet is not without honor, except in his own hometown, among his relatives, and in his own household. And he could do no mighty works there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. What you have to understand there, when it says he could do it, it doesn't mean that it was impossible for him to work there. It was pointless for him to work there. He could do no work there because they wouldn't listen. They had already rejected him. Yes, sir.
With the situation today with us, it's easier to teach someone that don't know who you are than it is to teach someone in family or friend. They know who you are.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some truth to that. And sometimes your past does haunt you in terms of that. That happened to Paul. When Paul went into Jerusalem and tried to work with the church in Jerusalem, they didn't want to have anything to do with him. Why? Because they knew his past. And someone had to go in and convince them that he had changed.
Mike, the class struggle is not always a conscious issue, but you think that was part of something that was going on here? Like, you're not from a family of, I don't know, Levite or priest or your dad or grandpa wasn't a high priest. You can't be.
Yeah, possibly. I mean, he was one of them. I mean, the whole point is a prophet is not without honor except in his hometown among his own family. His point was being that familiarity breeds contempt among people. And that's kind of what Byron was talking about to some extent. The folks I went to high school with in early years in my college probably are surprised when they find out I'm a preacher. And they probably aren't beating down the door when I come close. They're not going to travel 20 miles to hear me preach. They're going to go, I know him. Hopefully they don't know me. They think they do.
I think that I can see that being me because I think it's so human. Like, where am I going to expect God to show up? And it could be through the most surprising of persons.
Yep. The Apostle Paul.
You know what gets me about that is I'm kind of reverse thinking. It's like, okay, Paul went to school. He should have been like a number one apostle. Peter was a fisherman, got hooks in his thigh. Like, where did that go? And he's more of the predominant figure in the ministry of Jesus.
Yep. It's very interesting. I mean, Paul is even more unlikely, though, because he wasn't there during the ministry of Jesus. So even the apostles had trouble accepting Paul. Who was in the church at Jerusalem? The apostles. So even they had trouble accepting Paul and had to be convinced. Not to mention, Paul was the nut one that went off and started preaching to the Gentiles. And Paul had to remind Peter, hey, you were chosen first to go to the Gentiles. Don't forget about that Cornelius thing. So life gets in between us and belief. Things that we hear from people that we think are educated and smart, and things that are from people that are influential. We hear these things and then we say, who's Jesus? That's exactly what's going on here. They were amazed by his teaching. They recognized that this was superhuman. Where did he get this knowledge? Where did he get this wisdom? They were amazed by the things that they had heard that he had done. And he even worked a few miracles right there in Nazareth. That's what the text says. A few sick people, he healed them. So they have the ability and the information and the confirmation of God. And yet what happens? Life. Wait a minute. He's marrying Joseph's boy. We watched him grow up. He's a carpenter. What does a carpenter know?
Nails.
Where did he go? Yeah, he knew nails very well in a couple of years. Where did he go to school? What does he know about preaching? You'll recall that Jesus would later teach his disciples, go out and teach these people, but if they don't receive you, kick the dust off your feet and move on down the road and look for somebody who. That's essentially what he is doing here. He could do nothing because they rejected him. It was time to move on. It was a waste. And it is a waste to talk to people who are unwilling to listen.
Like, in that regard, do we not do it anyway? Kind of like Jesus was there anyway. And it's actually like that event is a testimony for Jesus.
We try.
Against those people.
Yeah, we try anyway.
We try. And I mean, aren't we supposed to?
But we need to be wise enough to perceive the response. In other words, I don't need to spend day after day after day after day talking to someone who refuses to listen. Or hour after hour after hour arguing with someone on Facebook. That is a drain of your time. It is a drain of your resources. It is a drain on your health. When you could be out talking to someone who will actually receive the seed. Now, you go back to the parable of the sower. The sower doesn't decide before he scatters the seed what soil he's going to. No, he broadcasts the seed. And some of it falls on this kind of. What we're learning here is that we need to be perceptive and realize, wait a minute, this soil is not receptive. This is a waste of time. The bird's just going to come carry it away. I think Byron had his hand up and then Mike. Nope, okay. Yeah. Yeah, and I want to make a clarification here. The word argue is vague. Is vague. It's used in common vernacular different than it's used in a specific setting. Argument is not bad when it's understood as being the exchange of ideas for the purposes of determining truth.
So argue is bad,
So,
debate is
yeah,
good.
arguing and debate are the same thing. However, commonly we use that word to talk about fighting with words. Okay, that's not healthy. That's not good. That doesn't accomplish anything. If people are not listening, then there's not true argumentation taking place. Argumentation involves the exchange of ideas in a common search for identifying what is true. That's what goes on and supposed to go on. Supposed to go on when Congress is debating bills to decide whether or not to pass them. It's usually not what goes on, but that's what's supposed to go on. That's what's supposed to go on in the court of law. That's what's supposed to go on in school classrooms. That's what is supposed to go on in scholarly conferences. That's what's supposed to go on in philosophical debates. Is this exchange of ideas. Sometimes it's heated. We don't need to just think that because it's a heated discussion that it's a non-productive discussion. We need to determine whether the discussion is productive. All right, we got Mike, and then we got Karen, and then I saw one other hand go up.
So Paul writes, I planted, Apollos water, and then God causes the growth. That's different than I think the average typical Church of Christ mentality, in the sense that I just told you the gospel, I want the microwave results now.
Exactly.
I have to walk away. You're lost and die in your sin. Whereas that soil may eventually grow, needing Apollos to come along, waiting on it. So I don't think Paul was, I think that I have to drop the idea that, well, I just told you God's word, you're not accepting it. Through our debate, I understand you have an issue and sparks here.
Give it some time. And see, this goes back to chapter 4, verses 26 through 29. The kingdom of God is as a man should scatter seed on the ground. He sleeps and rises night and day, and the seed sprouts and grows. He knows not how. I planted, Apollos watered, God gives the growth. I don't know how it grows. I sleep night and day. I go to bed every night. I get up in the morning. It's either growing or it's not growing. I don't have anything to do with it. All I'm doing is scattering the seed. The earth produces by itself, first the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. But when the grain is ripe, at once he puts in the sickle because the harvest has come. So once the word does the job in the soil of a man's heart, I need to be prepared to do what? Reap the harvest. What Jesus teach? Behold, the fields are white in harvest, but the workers are few. We need to be scattering, and we need to be waiting, and then we need to be watching for the harvest. Unfortunately, for far too many of us, we think that we are the ones that produce the growth. We do not. That is what Paul was talking about when he said, I watered, Apollos watered. I planted, Apollos watered, but God caused the increase. Neither I nor Apollos are anything but God who causes the growth. It's about getting the information out, letting people receive the information, and just because someone is hard-headed and it takes a long time does not mean that it is not working or that it will not work.
Think Paul.
Or any number of people. All right, Miss Karen, you had a comment.
Jesus was perfect. He lived a perfect life. He was perfect. It looks like they would have realized and remembered that he was special and he was different than other kids as he grew up. And they would think, oh yeah, this is the different one in the family.
But that's not actually what they saw. They saw a man. They saw a young person grow up, increase in wisdom and knowledge and stature in favor of God and men. I'm sure he had a good reputation. But he left home, and when he came back home, he was saying things to them that were amazing. And instead of saying, let me listen and see what I can learn, they did exactly what we do. They became defensive. Who are you to come tell us these things?
And at one point they think he's crazy.
Yes, his physical brothers literally thought he was out of his mind. Okay, somebody else had their hand up a moment ago. I don't remember who it was. Go ahead.
But wasn't it told that a Messiah was coming?
Yes, they were. And they were even looking for the Messiah.
It was hard, so they didn't want this new person to be the Messiah.
He was not the Messiah they were looking for. What they wanted was a new King David.
Full grown.
Not a lamb slaughtered.
Yeah.
They wanted someone wielding a sword in the flesh, winning back Jerusalem, winning back their power, winning back their money, winning back their place on the world stage, winning back their earthly kingdom, and he said, my kingdom is not of this world. They didn't want a kingdom that wasn't of this world. They wanted what they wanted. Any other questions or comments? All right, we've kind of reached sort of a good place to stop. I will read the last part of verse 6. Well, verse 6. I don't think I did that. He marveled because of their unbelief. I want you to realize this is God going, really?
Well, isn't that us? Like when we listen to the news, I'm like, really?
He marveled because of their unbelief, and he went about among the villages teaching. Here's the next thing. Just because someone rejects the message, don't stop. Don't think they're rejecting you. They're not rejecting you, they're rejecting God. They're rejecting the message of God. They're rejecting the call to repentance. You just go on to the next person and say, what do you know about God? Let's talk about it. And see if they're more receptive. He marveled because of their unbelief and went about among the villagers teaching. So there we go. We'll pick up, Lord willing, chapter 6, verse 7, which is the record of him sending out the 12 in Mark's gospel. Appreciate your presence, your comments, and your participation.
Sing the wondrous love of Jesus, sing his mercy and his grace. In the mansions bright and blessed, he'll prepare for us a place.
When we
all get to heaven,
what a
day of rejoicing that will be when we all see Jesus. We'll sing and shout the victory.